Alright guys, death penalty class, this is video number 2, and this is a briefer video about the history of the death penalty in North Carolina. You're going to have a reading assignment where you read my report that I did for the North Carolina ACLU, and I also delivered that report through a press release that I had in Raleigh, delivered it to the governor and to the legislature and the Attorney General, who at the time was Attorney General, who's now the governor, Roy Cooper. He's also seen the study. But this is a study in North Carolina that reviews every published study through 2011 in the state, as well as the data available at the time. Remember, we haven't had an execution since 2006. And so I was trying to show the state through data whether it was a good idea to continue to use the death penalty or not, based on taxpayer-funded research through people like myself. Okay, so read that. There's also a YouTube video you can watch that summarizes that, and then there's a link to an op-ed that I wrote in the Raleigh News Observer where I actually proposed that we abolish the death penalty based on that research. Now we'll get to that later in the future and see whether you agree with it or not. But whether you agree with it's irrelevant. That's not how you're going to be graded. What you think, okay? You're graded based on whether you understand the material. All right, so through the history of North Carolina, we played a major role in the death penalty. We were, again, a top 10 state in terms of the number of death sentences we handed down, the size of our death row, and the number of executions we carried out in a year. You'll see the death penalty is largely a southern thing. North Carolina is a southern state, so that's not surprising. But again, we had the largest decline of any state from the 1990s to the 2000s in the number of death sentences. So this is to explain why. Our first execution that I know about was 1726. George Seneca, who was a Native American who was hanged for the crime of murder. Okay, this comes from the SB file that I mentioned that's linked in your PowerPoint slideshow on the history of North Carolina's death penalty. It's slide number 2. Okay. And our last execution, again, was in August of 2006. Samuel Flippin, a white man, committed murder, who was sentenced to death via lethal injection. Now, a couple key points before we get to why the death penalty has stopped here. The first point is the death penalty was historically reserved for black people, African Americans, and in particular African American men. In the history of our state, you could be executed not only for murder, but also for the crimes of burglary and rape. So property crime and a violent crime that does not involve death. So you'll see the data from 1910 to 1961. We executed 71 rapists. 62 were African American. That's 87%. They were all males. And from 1910 to 1961, we executed 11 burglars. All of them were African American, and all of them were men. Okay, so historically, the death penalty was being used against black men, African Americans, for relatively minor crimes. Now, rape, in my opinion, is maybe even worse than murder because the victim has to live with that. It's very traumatic, so I'm not trying to diminish that. But it's not murder. Legally today, you can't be executed for that crime. So that's what I meant by relatively minor. Okay. Today, more than half of death row inmates in North Carolina are black people, African American. Most of them are men. Now, you might argue that the death penalty is then biased against black people, and frankly, you'd be wrong. Here's why. African Americans make up about 50% of the murders in the state, according to official statistics. So if they make up 50% of people on death row, that's what you'd actually expect. In fact, what you'll see in contemporary death penalty research is something called the race of victim bias. And that is something that's been documented throughout the South and other states as well, including North Carolina, where it's who you kill that matters. Killers of whites are far more likely to be sentenced to death than killers of blacks. Now, most murder, if you know in criminology and criminal justice, most murder is interracial, committed in the same race. So if killers of whites are being sentenced to death, it's generally white people that are being sentenced to death because white people kill white people. However, you'll see nationally, black people who kill white people are the most likely to be executed, particularly when they kill a white woman. That might be something unique to the South, right? We'll get to that later in the class when we talk about alleged problems. You'll see a slide from Frank Baumgartner from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's slide number 4 in your North Carolina death penalty history. This is the odds of getting the death penalty based on who you kill, and you see that people who kill white females in North Carolina are far more likely to be executed in the state of North Carolina. People who kill black males are almost never executed. So again, we have this kind of reverence for white victims, particularly white females. For some reason, we find them more vulnerable, or if it's based on legal factors, that means there were more aggravated legal factors in the cases against white females than there were in the others that might explain this. Okay, we'll get to that later when we look at alleged bias. Real quickly, going back to those dates from the previous video. Our death penalty was struck down in 1972 by the Supreme Court in the case of Furman versus Georgia. But the death penalty was reinstated by the Supreme Court, as I said, in 1976 in the case of Gregg versus Georgia. Again, we'll get to this later when we look at the law. But our death penalty approach, when the death penalty was struck down, we passed a mandatory death sentence. This is Woodson versus North Carolina. The Supreme Court actually struck that down and said it was unconstitutional. You can't kill them all. Discretion of a prosecutor is vital to justice. A verdict by a jury, discretion of a jury is vital to justice. And so the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty being mandatory. Again, we'll get to that later in the law unit. So then in 1977, we wrote a new law similar to the one in Georgia, where juries are now given guidance about who lives and dies. So again, there's aggravating factors specified by statute, mitigating factors specified by statute, and the aggravating factors must outweigh the mitigating factors. I'll explain that more in the law unit. But basically, the jury has to have more reason to impose a death and not impose a death for someone accused of capital murder. Okay, and that's the system we've been using. There's significant problems with that, as you'll see when we talk about the alleged problems with the death penalty, including jury confusion and incompetence when someone's life is on the line. Now, lethal gas was used until 1983. Lethal injection became a choice. Now, you can read about the last person gassed in the United States, or sorry, the last person gassed in the state of North Carolina. So here's how it works. We'll get to this in the methods of execution. You have an inmate who's masked, who's tied to a chair in a sealed room, a chamber, and they're sitting above a bucket of acid. And a cyanide capsule would be dropped in that acid and would then release its vapors into the air, and they would instruct the inmate to breathe deeply. Just get it over with. Well, of course, he would hold his breath as long as he could, and then he would take a deep breath. This is supposed to be instantaneous death. It's supposed to be humane. You'll see the Supreme Court has ruled that death cannot be lingering. It could be no more than the mere extinguishment of life. So someone suffering for 20 minutes would be ruled perhaps cruel and unusual. Well, this inmate kept saying, I'm human, I'm human, I'm human, I'm human, and then I'm hume, I'm hume, I'm hume, and then hume, hume. It was a horrible, horrible thing to see. And so gas was replaced with lethal injection and ultimately eliminated in 1998 after that execution. Now, 1999 and 2008, we have 5 people who were released from death row in North Carolina, innocent people, right? There's a CNN special called Rogue Justice that I would highly recommend you watch if you can find it. In 2011, it's about the state of North Carolina's crime lab and the faulty blood evidence that was used against people in death penalty cases. 3 of those folks were executed. It does not mean they were innocent, but there's some significant evidentiary problems. And I'll encourage you to look up the case of Greg Taylor, who's linked in the slideshow, who was convicted wrongly of murder based on blood evidence that turned out to be red paint. There's evidence that people in the crime lab were testifying, lying under oath, under the direction of their supervisor about blood evidence to convict people who turn out to be innocent of murder. Well, obviously, even if you support the death penalty, people don't like executing innocent people. So this is one of the reasons why the death penalty has disappeared in North Carolina. You'll see some key dates in slide number 6 about other things, and all of these are indicated and discussed in your report on the death penalty in North Carolina. From 2000 to 2009, The Office of Indigent Services and Office of Capital Defender underwent significant reforms, guaranteeing death penalty inmates a qualified attorney. Studies started coming out about the cost of death penalty being more expensive in North Carolina than keeping someone in prison for life. We'll get to that later. It's hard to believe, but true. Prosecutors under state law were given guidance or discretion not to seek the death penalty, so now it became completely up to them. Post-conviction DNA testing became available in 2001, so now people have more opportunities for appeal and to show that they're innocent. In 2004, the state passed a law requiring prosecutors to share all evidence with defense attorneys through open file discovery. And so all of this makes the death penalty more hard to obtain, a death sentence and an execution. But a really fascinating thing happened from 2007 to 2009. The medical board decided that doctors would not participate in lethal injection because it's a violation of their Hippocratic oath to do no harm. The Department of Corrections sued, can you believe that? Sued the medical board and won at the state Supreme Court, saying that they could coerce or force doctors to participate. Judge Donald Stevens, you can read about him. I would suggest you Google it. North Carolina death penalty, in his name, Google that. And you'll see that the Council of State was supposed to review any change in execution protocols if they were made to lethal injection. The Council of State is made up of the heads of states, heads of different departments in the state that have no idea about the death penalty or about crime. But they're supposed to, by law, review any protocol changes, and they didn't. And Judge Donald Stevens ruled they didn't have to, so the death penalty went on. However, you'll see that lethal injection has been challenged as cruel and unusual punishment, and that has not been resolved. Therefore, we're not allowed to execute anyone until those cases are resolved. Okay. Now, you might be wondering, how can lethal injection be considered cruel and unusual? We'll talk about that in the methods of execution section of the class later on. Okay. But quickly, if you're using 3 drugs, one makes you pass out, the other one paralyzes you, the third one stops your heart. The third one turns out to be very painful if you don't get enough of the first one. But the second one paralyzes you, so you're just sitting there paralyzed in complete agony. That's the allegation. Okay, we'll talk about that later. The Racial Justice Act was passed. North Carolina became only the second state in the history of the country to pass such a law. Ours was much more broad than the first one in Kentucky. If you could show that people of your race were being singled out for the death penalty, then your death sentence could be overturned. 4 people challenged this, and their death sentences were overturned. They were released from death row. This is under a Democratic legislature in North Carolina with a Democratic governor. Republicans took control of the state, as you probably know, for the first time in something like 150 years. One of the first things they did was abolish the Racial Justice Act. They did it twice. The first time the governor vetoed it. The second time they overrode the veto, Democratic governor. So the Racial Justice Act was eliminated, and those death sentences were actually reinstated. Can you believe that? But now we start to see significant evidence of racial bias. So we have innocent people being released from death row. We have evidence of racial bias by published studies by professors in the state. And so we start moving away from the death penalty, right? The juries stop imposing it. Murder fell to its lowest level in recorded history. So there's not much of a need for the death penalty. There's not much of a push for it as well. And yet, from 2012 to 2019, the Republican legislature tries to resume the execution, which is their legal right. This is one of their values as conservatives, as Republicans. They want to get tough on crime. So they declared by law that lethal injection was not a medical procedure, so it doesn't require a doctor. They changed the execution protocol from 3 drugs to 1, not telling anyone what that drug is and whether it's been used before and whether it's effective. And they said a doctor doesn't even need to be present in order for an execution. Now, in spite of these efforts, obviously we've not resumed executions yet. So you look at slide number 7, the outcome of all of this is a significant decline in the number of death sentences in North Carolina. The first time we've ever seen zero death sentences, 2012. And then we saw it again In 2016, 2018, 0 death sentences, okay? For the first time in the contemporary era, we had about 3 last year, but see, the death sentences are being almost never imposed now. 3 out of like 500 or 600 murders, 3 death sentences. This becomes important for the issue of deterrence. You'll see later. Do you think a would-be murderer would be deterred or afraid of a death sentence if there's a 3 in 600 chance that they'll get it? Pretty rare, right? We'll talk about that later when we talk about deterrence. Now, go ahead and read my study on the death penalty that's linked in the slideshow, and you'll see 5 key facts that are established about the death penalty in North Carolina. You can also watch the video where I summarize it to a beat that I made, the music that I made. And you can also read an op-ed that I wrote for the News and Observer that kind of takes a stance. Now, the report doesn't take a stance because it was delivered to the legislature and just said, you guys do what you think is appropriate. My opinion, based on the research, is that we just don't need to do it. It doesn't mean I don't favor the death penalty. It means it's a failed policy. We'll talk about that later when we evaluate the policy overall. But a failed policy means either it doesn't meet its goals or the costs outweigh the benefits. And then be sure to check out the website from the North Carolina Department of Public Safety that I've linked as well that talks about the death penalty in North Carolina. And I would encourage you as we move on to look at the state laws as well. So I'll link those later in the class as well. But this is just a quick rundown of the history of North Carolina's death penalty, and it'll be the second video. Make sure again that you guys talk about this on the forum. If you have any questions, reach out to me.